Thanks, Michael. I appreciate your introduction. And welcome to the Montalbano Family Theatre. If you haven't been here, I don't know how long it's been here, but it's been here for a little while now. I'm the editor of Pancouver, and what we do, it's an online media outlet at pancouver.ca with occasional print editions, and we focus on underrepresented artists. And Vancouver's teamed up with the Asian Canadian Special Events Association on this project we're calling Beyond Chinese. And part of it is hosting panel discussions, but we're also putting articles on our website, trying to show the diversity of people with Chinese ancestry in Vancouver. And that diversity can be geographic, it can also be gender identification, sexual orientation, age, it can be anything. So national origin. And tonight I'm delighted to be joined by four highly artistic Vancouverites who reflect this diversity. I'll start with Derek Chan, is Managing Artistic Director of Vancouver Asian Canadian Theatre. He's a playwright, director, performer, translator, and producer. He's been co-artistic director of Rice and Beans Theatre since 2010. And Derek is from Hong Kong, so let's give a warm welcome to Derek Chan. And Natasha Chew was producer and marketing manager of I Fear Love, which was at the Fringe Festival recently, a former president of the UBC Players Club. She wrote the play A Captivating Woman. She's mixed race with Chinese and Filipino ancestry and was born in Singapore. So let's give a warm welcome to Nat. Nat or Natasha, whatever you prefer when the questions come. Nancy Lee does pretty well everything. Nancy is a media artist, curator, filmmaker, DJ, cultural producer, co-producer and co-founder of Current Feminist Electronic Art Symposium. It's an intersectional and multidisciplinary initiative. And Nancy was born in Taichung, Taiwan. Welcome, Nancy. And Yilin Wang is a Chinese diaspora writer, poet, and Chinese-English translator. Yilin is editor and translator of The Lantern and the Night Moths, which recently won the John Glasgow Translation Prize, a national prize. Yilin has written for many publications: Clark's World Fantasy Magazine, Malahat Review, Grain, CV2, Ex-Puritan, Toronto Star, Words Without Borders. There's more, but that's probably enough for now. And Yilin was born in the Chinese province of Sichuan. Let's welcome Yilin to the panel. So now what I'm going to do is I will ask a few questions, and then we'll welcome questions from the audience. Okay, I will ask some questions, then we'll welcome some questions from the audience. And I'm going to start by asking everyone on the panel to share how you became interested in your particular art form, and maybe even briefly explain why you do what you do. So I'll start with you, Derek.
Thanks, Charlie. Strangely, I grew up in Hong Kong, so as many of you know, the schooling education system was and is still very rigid. So these kind of arts activities were not particularly encouraged as a profession. But it really also encourages students to do as many extracurricular activities as possible. So, like do your drama club and speech club and volleyball or whatever. So it was one of the things that my parents signed me up for when I was about 11 years old, between the equivalent of grades 5 and 6 in Hong Kong or something. Like I just did a summer's children's musical back in Hong Kong. And it was meant to be, it's kind of like an extra credit kind of thing, because grades were important. And what my parents didn't know was that I truly enjoyed doing that and enjoyed it so much that I asked to do it again the year after. and then soon, halfway through high school, the first couple years of high school, I just kind of decided that that's what I was going to do, even though my parents weren't really into it. You know, get a real job, get a degree, and all that stuff, which actually partly led to me leaving Hong Kong to study theater here through a somewhat convoluted path in Europe towards my late teens. Yeah, so that's kind of how I got into it. And when I first moved to Vancouver, I was not gonna stay. I genuinely thought it was really boring. And I was gonna, you know, go back to Hong Kong, go back to the big city, or go back to Europe or whatever. But I found my people here. One of them was, well, he's still alive, Pedro Chamale, my co-artistic director, whom I founded Rice and Beans Theater with. I was the rice, he was the beans. Long story there, maybe for a different panel. We have a really good reason for it, in addition to it being a really good joke. So yeah, really finding my people, and I don't, well, in the beginning, I couldn't see myself doing anything else. I needed to tell stories. Like since I was a child, I had this weird obsession with like making little storybooks, or like, oh, hey, look at me, I'm, you know, telling you a weird story or something. So I stuck with that, and you know, all the other things like producing and being an artistic director and all of that comes from the people I met throughout the way. A lot about treating other people right and why it is important to tell stories. In the beginning, it was like, oh, this was fun. I didn't hate doing this because I hated doing everything else. But yeah, throughout the last 15 years or so, actually working as an artist, I think my why has changed a lot from personal interest to community interest to maybe actually more political interest right now. So yeah.
And Nat?
I actually think we have a really similar experience in that I'm from Singapore. It's also a really rigid schooling system, and there was actually no extracurricular points tied to doing theater. They were like, why are you doing that? And I was like, I love it. But I think, I don't know, as a kid, and I still think this, but like there is no other art form where you can lock people in a room and make them listen to you. I mean, this is as well. But just like it's always drawn me towards live arts, and I think there's something, especially after the pandemic, I've been thinking a lot about it. The feeling of being in the room with people and like experiencing the same thing. Like I love a packed movie theater, that's theater. I love stand-up comedy, that's theater. I love improv, even though I shouldn't admit that because I don't love improv. But like there's something about feeling the connection, not just with the audience, but with the actors, and like walking out of there changed. And I think like that's the thing that's always drawn me back to theater. Yeah, so yeah, and I think especially in Southeast Asia, growing up in Singapore, it was hard to find places as a queer person, as a woman, as an Asian person to scream. And so like I still think that theater is a place where you can scream and be heard.
Okay, Nancy?
My story, I guess, is a little bit different. I never wanted to be an artist. I never thought about being an artist. I came to art pretty late in my life. Now that I look back in my youth, I was a pretty troubled teenager, and I see the value of art. That could have done me some good earlier on in my life. So I actually got into like my creative field through filmmaking. I was actually I was in a pre-med program at UBC, so I was kind of on that path, and came to the realization that I hate hospitals. Can't even bring myself to go to one when I'm sick. So It was a reality check. And then I got into documentary filmmaking by taking a course with Dr. Henry Yu through just like discovering historiography and storytelling through primary sources in the kind of process of constructing Chinese Canadian history. So that was just like one course, and then it kind of got me into working with video as a medium. And then it was through that, then I started, now that I have these like technical skills, I was able to apply it to my hedonistic life, you know, as someone who liked to party a lot. Because being able to work with audio-visual formats means I could now start doing installations. I can work with projections, I can do projection mapping, I can VJ, I can DJ, so I can apply it in a party setting. I mean, I love partying. I've been partying for a really, really long time. But at that moment in time, I didn't really think about like, you know, partying in like the political kind of sense, like the space of resistance. We just needed to scream. But it was through that, then I think facing resistance with how difficult it is to throw parties in Vancouver, then it became much more of a political gesture. And yeah, that's where I am now.
Yilin, you're in the literary world. I'm curious why this is compelling to you.
Yeah, it's been really interesting to kind of hear about everyone's journeys, and I have a feeling we have like a lot of overlapping community, just hearing everyone share kind of their stories. For me, like I became interested in Chinese literature and kind of storytelling when I was growing up, thanks to my grandparents, because I, like maybe many kind of Chinese folks, had to memorize Tang Dynasty poetry growing up. Is there anyone else here who had to study, you know, Levi's famous poem about the moon that everyone who went to Chinese school maybe knows? Yeah, so I became very interested in kind of literature and storytelling, and then I moved around a lot as a child, and I had a lot of free time on my hands, so I started journaling, I started writing, creating stories, making up worlds, and I found myself writing a lot of poetry in high school, and then getting into like various genres of creative writing, from kind of arts and culture writing, reviewing journalism, to then kind of speculative fiction and poetry. And then I decided, against my parents' wishes, that I wanted to study creative writing and become a writer, like the rebellious Chinese daughter that I am. And I went and did a BFA and MFA at UBC, studying creative writing. And then during my master's, I started noticing that even though I'm bilingual, that the education I've had in like English lit programs and like workshops and kind of writing spaces have been really focused on like Anglophone, you know, Western literature and kind of classics in the canon. So I started seeking out more like world lit and translations of Chinese lit, works by like Asian and BIPOC authors. And that brought me then into translation. And in April, my first book of translations came out, The Lantern and the Night Moth. I actually had my book launch at the VPL back in April. So thank you, VPL, for being so supportive. And it's a book of modern and contemporary Chinese poetry and translation, along with personal essays about the art and craft of translation. And for me, it's really important to be able to kind of share like my kind of multicultural and kind of multilingual kind of background with readers through this kind of hybrid text, combining kind of both the original Chinese along with English translations, and also like essays about like what Chinese poetry means to me personally and what I enjoy about reading it, and also like the challenges of translation and kind of working across languages. And I write a lot about like those things, like how do you kind of make decisions as a translator, and also like the underappreciation people have for like the lack of appreciation for kind of the work that a translator does.
And I want to add that those essays are amazing, Yilin. They really I recommend them to anyone in the room. If you get a chance to read these essays, you will be blown away. Next, Derek. I'm curious how your history in Hong Kong and your ancestry informs your artistry in Vancouver.
Back in 2014, I was about 4 years out of theater school. Rice and Beans was, happening, and I was finally begin to work mostly professionally. Most of my income is coming from theater or from the arts. And 2014 was also when the umbrella movement happened in Hong Kong, inspired by the Occupy movements around the world. Students, young people, same thing, for democracy, for self-determination, for a future, for the Chinese government to do what they promised. And back then, 2014, 10 years ago, I pretty much honestly, I didn't care too much. Back then, I was like, wow, what's the point? Because, that's what we've all been taught back home in school. What's the point? Just keep your head down, paint inside the lines, you'll be fine. Live a undisturbed life, so to speak. And then, life went on. The movement was, kind of squashed, like always. And there were a few other things that happened between then, but 2019 came around, and that was the other giant wave of pro-democracy protests in Hong Kong, stemming from in the beginning it was a extradition law back to mainland China kind of protest, and it branched off into many things and grew into many different things with many different ways to go about it as well. And for some reason, at that time, I don't know what it was, I thought I needed to do something. To add to that, I didn't leave Hong Kong in very good terms with the place. Hated it, couldn't wait to get out. By that point, probably have not seen my parents in person in about 15 years or so. Like, we text and stuff, but that's a different story for a different day. So I don't know what it is. Maybe I have finally come around to the fact that, like, Derek, you are from Hong Kong, you still count, hopefully, and what's the use of abandoning that part of you? Your family's still there. You have things that you care about there. So do something. And I talked to a mentor of mine, a friend and mentor of mine, when I was on tour in Toronto with a different show. And I said, hey, maybe I should go back. Maybe I should go back. Kids are dying on the streets, or disappearing on the streets. And he said to me, hey, Derek, you can go back. You can go back for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month, whatever. But are you prepared to go back and finish what you wanted to start over there? Or is there a way for you to use your training and expertise to tell the story here, to make sure that people remember what we were fighting for, what we have always been fighting for over here? And there is also a community here. Like, look at this, there's also a community here. And I think that's what's been driving my work for the last few years. And a lot of it is guilt. A lot of it is guilt, the way I left Hong Kong and the way that I have kept Hong Kong at an arm's length for many years. My first 10 years in Canada, I pretended that I didn't understand or speak any sort of Chinese because, it's stupid. I don't want to, I need to get a job, blah, 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 blah. So a lot of it is guilt, but over the years, it is really, it's really love. Like, I'm 38. I'm not that old, but I'm not young anymore. And when you think about, will I personally have a chance to go see go back to see Hong Kong that I still somewhat remember? Probably not. So what do we do? What now? What's next? And that drives a lot of my work now.
I guess that's what led up to Yellow Objects.
Yeah, Yellow Objects, Happy Valley, a bunch of other side projects that are coming up.
And Nat, being from Singapore, which is very diverse, how did living in this Southeast Asian city-state shape you as a theater artist? Or did it?
Thank you. I don't know. I thought this question was really interesting because I think that with my background, it is very hard to pinpoint exactly where my influences come from. My dad's Canadian Chinese, in that my grandparents were the ones who came here first. But then I grew up in Singapore and my mom's Filipino. And so there's not really kind of a region that I'm like, yes, this is where everything comes from. These are my roots. I think really a lot of my work is about being like rootless and feeling unmoored and like that kind of wildness that comes with it. Like I love writing about crazy women. I love crazy women. Like I think it's so great because it's just something that we don't see enough of, I think, in a way that we can understand and empathize with. But I think like the biggest thing that I kind of take away from Singapore now that I haven't been back in like 3 years is that sense of like community. I think Singapore was a place with a lot of like third spaces that I think are missing a lot from white places I've been. Because I think that the weather is temperate, so then you can be outside all the time, and then there's just so much space to gather. And like, I think that my like longing to be around people and to create spaces for people, like in small ways it's appearing in my work, in which I can't think of a project that I haven't invited every single friend on and been like, you should work on this. Or like, I love to make a group chat and stuff like 20 people in the group chat when I'm just trying to go out to the movies. But yeah, like I think that it's really driven this sense of like community building in my work that I think a lot of people who talk to me and like want to work with me as a producer enjoy. Like I do really think that it is become like a core thing in my practice to make sure that the first thing before art making is community building and making sure that everybody is feeling kind of a sense of space with each other. Yeah.
That's wonderful. And Nancy, how has your Taiwanese heritage shaped your perspective as a media artist or cultural producer, DJ, or has it?
You know, to be honest, like when I first kind of got into art making, I was like in my mid-20s or so. I did not really think too much about, being Taiwanese at that moment because, I was trying to do things in the music industry, in like an underground rave scene. It's not that nuanced, you're just not white. like, I'm not gonna explain like Taiwan, in that, it's very complicated. So that wasn't really a thing, but all of my closest friends, I started a DJ collective, Chapel Sound Art Foundation, like Chapel Sound as a DJ collective. We incorporated much later on, and all the people that were involved were very diverse. Like the guy that started it, he was a newcomer from Korea, and just moved here from New York after he finished school there. So. And then there are people who are Vietnamese, Filipino, Japanese, mixed heritage. There are some white folks too. Like, it's all very mixed. And we just really wanted to jam and do music and like throw events together. But I do think like maybe being Asian growing up in Vancouver, I felt an affinity to DJ culture. Because growing up, a lot of my Asian friends were into DJing and breakdancing. So I think growing up in high school here, you kind of just, I think maybe I'm like speaking generally, but my experience growing up here in Vancouver, I grew up in Richmond, like as an Asian person in school, as someone who is like maybe not just like moved here from Asia, that kind of grew up here, the sense of systemic racism is like very, very, very apparent. And you only have like a few avenues to kind of get into. Either you hang out with the white kids, or like maybe you're like a nerd, or you're into the cool things. And that's either like breakdancing or DJing or gang-related activities. Yeah, like that's the reality. So you kind of had to figure out like what that is, and I think for me, I was into partying, so that was the type of life that I was into. So I was kind of in nightlife already, like by partying a lot. But it was much later in my like mid-20s that I realized the purpose of those spaces. Like I was able to intellectualize like why those spaces existed, why rebellious Asian teenage youth would go into these warehouse parties or throw these events or like have these illegal drinking places that they run or whatever, like why those spaces kind of exist. So I think, being Taiwanese, obviously a lot of Taiwanese people were involved, but Taiwanese people were, it was never really the majority. Like in Richmond, like I grew up, I was forced to learn Cantonese because everybody spoke Cantonese. So, you had to assimilate into other kinds of cultures. And then these days, it's mostly mainlanders. So being Taiwanese has never been a majority, I guess, in Vancouver's like Chinese diaspora. But yeah, I'll just end there for now.
Okay, and Yilin, you grew up in different parts of China, the U.S., and Canada, which sets you apart from many Chinese immigrants, I think, in Vancouver. And how did your upbringing shape your perspective as a writer and a poet and a translator?
Yeah, so just to contextualize, I had a very unusual childhood growing up because I was born in China, and then I moved to the U.S. when I was 5. And then around 7 or 8, I went back to China and then did several years of elementary school education in China, and then moved to Canada. And in that process, I learned English in the U.S. when I was 5, lost all my Chinese, as one does when you move at a very young age. Then had to relearn Chinese when I went back, and then again relearn English. And so in a way, I spent a lot of my life kind of growing up, kind of doing language learning and rethinking my relationship with the various places I kind of lived in. And so that kind of really informed my creative work, and I'm kind of writing poetry and stories that often explore kind of that part of my childhood. And since I'm a writer, I often write about these topics in my book as well. So I'm going to read like a couple short excerpts because I think that kind of really dive into some of these questions. I'm going to read just like the opening quote, which is from like a longer essay about how I got into writing poetry. Being an immigrant in the diaspora can often feel like drifting in a vast ocean with no shorelines in sight. When home isn't a person or a place or memories, but a wisp of smoke just beyond my grasp, a glass castle so ephemeral and elusive, poetry is one of my rare lifelines. It's the closest that I've ever felt to belonging. So for me, I think about that a lot when I'm writing. And I'm also going to read like 2 very short excerpts from one of the section about translating from diaspora. For over 20 years, I've lived in the Sino diaspora. The vast majority of my waking hours are now spent thinking, speaking, and writing in English. Translating Sinophone poetry, however, has become the most meaningful way in which I've been able to maintain a deep connection with my mother tongues. Not only do I rely on my knowledge of written Chinese, which I acquired through my formal and informal education in Mandarin to parse every ideograph of a poem, but I also read the lines aloud to hear the cadences in Mandarin and in Sichuanese. To reference a Chinese dialect is always to evoke a linguistic tie to a particular place, for Sinophone dialects can be as distinct as languages, differing by region, province, city, and even village or neighborhood, so specific that they can denote exactly where someone is from. To savor the rhythm of Chao Hui's poetry in the Yibing branch of the Sichuan dialect of my ancestral hometown, which I inherited from my grandparents, is a powerful act of intimacy. As I translate her poetry, I linger in the language of home, kingship ties, and ancestral lands. I imagine her words anew for all of us in the diaspora who share complex or fraught relationships with our mother tongues.
Thank you, Yilin. And speaking of language, that's a nice springboard into the next section. I'd like to ask you, Derek, you grew up presumably speaking Cantonese,
I did, yeah.
correct?
Yes.
And I'm wondering how, and regional languages in China are facing some challenges in certain areas. How, what's your relationship with Cantonese, and how does that manifest itself in your art?
So yeah, so to continue a bit of how like my first few years here, of course, you know, living in Hong Kong, you don't always see Cantonese as something precious, something to hold on to because you have got that every day, every minute at home. I already mentioned that when I first moved here, I distanced myself from the language and the culture and actually the people. And it was around, I believe, 2015, I want to say, a mentor and now also a friend and collaborator of mine found out that I am still fluent in Cantonese, and he went, "Hey, Derek, I would like you to translate a play, and I will direct it." So we met at a coffee shop on Commercial Drive, Turk's Coffee, and I was, you know, I was still pretty green back then, and there's this person, like an artistic director. It was Giovanni C, for those who know who he is. This artistic director, like, you know, national playwright and all that stuff. And then we're talking. He was like, "Oh yeah, do you wanna do like a Julia Thompson? Do you wanna do like a Morris Panish?" And then I just went, "Giovanni, I didn't grow up here. I don't know these playwrights. Like, yeah, I know they're like Canadian, very important playwrights, but I don't know. Like, I don't know them. Are you sure I can do it?" And then he just paused and went, "Can you cook?" And then I said, "What?" But then in my head, immediately I made the connection because he had been touring this solo show in which he cooks and talks about, he's Chinese Filipino, and and in that show he cooks and talks about essentially imperialism through food and kind of stories and colonialism. And then immediately I went, fuck, he's gonna ask me to do his solo show. So I just went, yeah, sure, you know, I've lived by myself for, you know, 10 years now. I can put a dish together. So that really kickstarted, like, he literally forced me to reconnect with like half of me that I tossed into the ocean on the airplane ride here to Vancouver. And then, you know, since then, we went to a translation residency in Quebec, and then since then, I really started realizing that, hey, Derek, like, you're a playwright, you know all these languages, like, this is part of you, use it. Like, come on, what are you doing here? Like, seriously, you know? So since then, I have, in a lot of my written works, I have incorporated, started incorporating Cantonese in it, in my plays and in my performances, sometimes Mandarin as well, very, very Hong Kong sounding Mandarin, by choice. And incorporating, yes, and to a point where my last couple performances might have been more Cantonese than English, but it wasn't billed as a Cantonese performance. It was billed as a multilingual audience, multilingual, intercultural kind of audience. and why I'm trying to do this, aside from self selfish reasons, it is that I do think that maybe it's naive to think that, hey, if people see that, oh, Cantonese can exist in the arts in Canada, that means it's in a weird way, roundabout way, not my logic, other people's logic, by their logic, legit, right? Like we count, right? Our languages make sense, like, and then also hearing stories other places too, like how Chinese is declining and blah blah blah, and of course we know that language suppression is a very useful tool for oppressors to take away our cultures, our memories, and our identities. So yeah, so I think that's why. And Cantonese is so fun. Like, if you know a Cantonese speaker, just ask them to teach you to say like the dirtiest bloody swears, and get them to explain to you word for word what that actually means, and like how that came about and all the variations of it. It's an amazingly beautiful, graphic language, and it sounds so fun. And like if you trace it all back, like trace it back to like how it became Hong Kong Cantonese, but then there's like Guangzhou Cantonese, and then like nearby regions and all of that. Like I do fear a lot of these languages that was demoted to regional dialects by oppressors disappearing because either people like speakers think that it's worthless, it's not official, or people outright banning it. So yeah, I care a lot about that.
Yeah, well, it was certainly the case in Canada too.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
And
yeah.
Natasha, you grew up in a multilingual city where several Chinese languages are spoken, English is commonly spoken, probably a lot of Malay, I'm guessing, and then you're a Filipino ancestry on your mother's side. I don't know if that meant Tagalog or one of the other languages. So what was it like for you growing up in such a multilingual city, and how did that shape you?
Well, fun fact about Singapore, there's actually 4 national languages. There's English, Mandarin, Bahasa Melayu, and Tamil or Hindi. I think that they codified both after a little while.
How many do you speak?
I technically speak 2 and a little bit, because Malay people are indigenous to Singapore, and so you all have to take a year of Bahasa Melayu, and it's great. It's very fun. And it's actually a really, really similar language family to Tagalog, so it was easier for me. But yeah, I think it's really interesting, especially because in Singapore there's the unofficial language of Singlish, although the government will never agree to that. But it is like a language for the people, and it's really interesting to see the way like the language itself has become like a language in its own, I guess. Like it's really similar to like Jamaican patois and like how it's studied. I used to want to be a linguist for a little bit. I had like a little stint of like, what if I did that? But studying Singlish was maybe the most important thing that has happened to me, because it's just this beautiful amalgamation of all the languages that exist and that have disappeared from the place. Like you find a lot of like Hakka in it, and it's really cool. But yeah, it's not very high status. In fact, I think Singapore has the Don't Speak Singlish campaign that's still ongoing. But yeah, I think like the way that's influenced me is like I love to see like the different patterns in things. Something that I'm currently working on is a fiction piece that's called Two Graves, and is kind of, I don't want to spoil it, but like crazy woman stuff again. But like it has a lot of like Asian influences, and like when I was pulling from everything about what kind of monster she was, I was realizing that like a lot of Asian cultures have the same kind of vein of monster in which women are usually vampires or vampiric. So like in the Philippines, we have something called the manananggal, which is like a woman that splits herself in half and then just like kind of like an iPhone charger, and then the iPhone flies away, where she's like, she leaves the bottom half of her body somewhere, and then she flies away with the top half to go kill babies. And then, yeah, look it up, it's really cool. And then in Chinese, we have like the white lady, that's a thing. And that's also a thing in like Thai culture. And it's really interesting to see where all these kind of images and like these cultural things that we're carrying forward come from, and how they've been distorted through the lens of colonialism. I think there are a lot of really great BC authors who are working on like parsing that. I have a book whose name I can't remember, but I will Google it. But he talks about aswang, which are like Filipino demons, and how they've been kind of distorted by colonialism, specifically like the manananggal that I've been talking about was actually a whole thing around indigenous women and like how they prey on white men. And so, yeah, I think a lot about like the connections between cultures, and like more about the things that bind us rather than the things that make us really different.
Okay, I'm going to be inviting questions after the next 2 questions, so you can think them up, and we'll get the audience involved. Nancy, you come from a country with a very complicated relationship to language. 50 years of Japanese colonization, and everyone had to learn Japanese, and then switch to Mandarin after the Second World War. Now we're seeing the, Taiwanese Hokkien and Hakka and indigenous languages coming to the forefront and in the spotlight. And what does this kind of tussle over languages tell you about the evolution of Taiwanese identity?
I feel like being Taiwanese is always like, or Taiwanese identity as a concept is always in flux. And it's always in response to who is in power. It's always a story of who is in power, and never a story about the actual people. So I think it's kind of cool that like there are more like language revivals. It's cool to see to be on like the train and hear like Hakka and like different languages. And I think like even today, like you still feel the remnants of like Japanese colonialism in Taiwan, like very strongly, not only through like infrastructure, but even just through behavior, the way you greet each other and things like that. There's still lots of Japanese like text that you would find, like hiragana, like that you would see in Taiwan. Even like I've been going to the south of Taiwan in the recent years because my sister has moved to Pingdong, which is like a southern kind of region in Taiwan. So previously when I used to go to Taiwan, I'm mostly in Taichung or Taipei. I would say like people generally speak more Mandarin there, but I think spending a little bit more time in the south of Taiwan, I've really noticed that just like it's different. People speak a lot more Taiwanese in the south, and I think growing up, I didn't really get to learn Taiwanese because, well, first of all, I grew up in Canada mostly, and like it was already difficult enough for me to learn like Mandarin. But I do hear it, like, when my like grandma wanted to talk shit about us, she would always do it in Taiwanese. But I think like in recent years, I've definitely been I've actually been looking up, like, because I know Taiwanese, like all the swear words, and like so I know when someone's talking shit about me in Taiwanese, like that very clearly. I feel like that's kind of like the things, or if you're in trouble, or if I was in trouble, like I would get yelled at in Taiwanese, or the swear words would come out in Taiwanese. So I'm quite aware of those things. But I do, now that I'm older, and I kind of want to look back, maybe look into ways that I can reconnect and learn more about, how to speak Taiwanese, because I do see kind of the value of it. And now that I'm studying Taiwanese history a little bit more, to understand the way the dialect is it's almost connected. Like all my friends who speak fluent Taiwanese, they're like, wow, you know, it's so useful to travel Southeast Asia with. They're like, wow, this is actually a very useful like, you know, they just grew up with it. They're like, oh, you can kind of understand like when you're traveling through Southeast Asia. So that has kind of gotten my curiosity. I did learn a bit of Japanese growing up as well too. Like it was, you know, it was kind of strange like when my mom was like, hey, well, you guys are going to start doing Japanese classes. You know, I'm like, why? But I think like the older I got, I was like, oh, okay, I see why. Because they lived through a period of time where that was still a valuable thing to do. So, you know, it's cool that I, you know, got to learn some Japanese. And I think that has like, just like growing up, being exposed to multiple languages has given me almost, I don't know, like I love the Chinese language. Like I think even though it was like very difficult to learn it growing up, nowadays when I started doing like Chinese calligraphy at actually like a temple in Richmond. Actually, it was through Taiwan Fest like years ago. Foguangshan, they had the like little booth, and they're like, do calligraphy, and I'm like, yo, this is so cool. So I started going in 2019 before the pandemic, and I'm like the only 30-something-year-old. Everybody there is like 60 to 90. But they're so curious. They're so interested. They're like, why are you here? But it was through that I learned so much Chinese poetry and so much about Chinese character etymology and just so much cultural elements with the language that now that I'm an artist, oftentimes when I need to find inspiration or when I get asked questions, I oftentimes will actually do research on the Chinese character, on the word, and looking at the history of the etymology to find concepts, because a lot of it is very pictographic. It's like you can find what, like, you know, what natural things kind of were drawing into this character, and then use that history to kind of tell the story that you wanted to tell. So yeah, so it's really interesting that now that I'm older, I'm like, because I hated going to Chinese school. It was like the worst torture like ever. But I think the older that I am now, I'm just like, wow, it's such a gift to be able to be connected with a language that is so old. You know, like I think you're talking about like Tangshi, like the Tang Dynasty poetry. So I got into that, like I was going to a breakup once, and I was like telling these old folks, I'm like, yo man, I'm going through this breakup, it's terrible. And they're like, oh, these are the poems, you know? These are the poems for the breakup. And I'm just like, okay, there's like this woman writer, and it was amazing to like see the translation of the poem, and I'm just like, damn, this is from 2,000 years ago, and I feel what she's feeling, you know? It was a poem about her being wasted and being drunk, and she's hungover, and she wakes up, and she's like, oh, why are the branch or the flowers on the trees like pink or green? Like she was just, you know, she was just really hungover and like asking this like mundane question. But I was just like, wow, I feel that. So I think I think it's so beautiful to be able to have some kind of access to language, and I really like encourage like everyone to even learn more about the different kinds of dialects and the different kind of languages that kind of evolve in different regions throughout Asia, because it's so fascinating how it's tied to history as well.
Thank you, Nancy. I was going to ask Yilin why she feels a need to translate Mandarin into English, but I think Nancy's already answered the question. But I will ask you, you know, there are lots of sinologists in universities doing this work, and in the face of that, why did you feel compelled to do it?
Yeah, I think the kind of work that I'm doing is very different. Like hearing you talk about like learning etymology and things like that, like I've also been recently taking classical Chinese lessons, and part of that is learning about kind of the ancient kind of etymology of words and how they used to be like several thousand years ago. It's like trying to study like medieval English, basically, just to give folks an idea, or trying to study Latin, basically. It's like a completely different language. It's very difficult and very fascinating, and it makes me want to learn all the languages, and kind of hearing people talk about Taiwanese, and I also want to learn Cantonese as well. including how to curse in Cantonese. So I feel like I have some questions. Yeah, but in terms of kind of why I translate, I actually do have a short kind of passage where I talk a little bit about the issues in publishing and kind of the erasure of kind of translators of color. So I just want to kind of share that, and then I'm going to discuss it a little bit more, which is, so the poetry written by racialized writers of marginalized genders, that's to say cis and trans women, trans men, non-binary folks, and anyone who's questioning, are triply underrepresented in English translation, simultaneously along the axes of language, race, and gender. Only roughly 3% of the books published in the United States each year are translations into English, a phenomenon that has been dubbed the 3% problem. Furthermore, the vast majority of the works chosen for translation are written by white Europeans, and out of all the English translations of Sinophone poetry books published from 2008 to 2022, 14 years, only 26% are written by women poets, and 26% translated by women translators, based on data gathered by Publishers Weekly Translation Database, which doesn't even record gender identity in like terms of like non-binary and trans folks as well. So that's kind of what I'm up against as a translator. You're marginalized in terms of gender, in terms of language, in terms of race. And when it comes to like Chinese poetry, there's a long history of it being kind of translated in very problematic ways. There's this kind of very colonial kind of practice called bridge translation, which a famous example is Ezra Pound. And what happened was that a lot of white academics and writers would work with a so-called native informant. I really dislike this word, by the way, native informant, who provides them with literal kind of notes on every word in a poem. And then they would take it and then rewrite it into a poem in English, these white authors like Pound, and call it a literary translation of the Chinese poem. If you know anything about how the Chinese language works, you would know that that does not work in terms of grammar, in terms of syntax, in terms of the missing cultural context. This practice still happens to this day, surprisingly and shockingly, with a lot of Asian languages. And it's very concerning that some of them continue to be published and win awards. And so I was very frustrated during my MFA to find this out. And I was like, I'm also a poet. I'm also multilingual. And I love Chinese poetry. Why don't I try to translate in a way that's more culturally sensitive, drawing on my lived experience, thinking about my relationship with the works and kind of my personal emotional understanding and appreciation for them, rather than kind of treating it as if this kind of Orientalist fantasy, of China. So yeah, that's kind of how I got into literary translation.
Thank you. Now is the time for people in the audience if you have questions, and we have a microphone that will come up. So we'll have you speak into the microphone. No, we need a microphone because it's being videotaped, and if you are asking a question, you may be in the video, so.
I think this is Cantonese, and I've been wondering for 45 years when I could use this. So, tiyu ne hai du le ping fu gazat ne ho ma. That's not funny? Is that not a swear?
I only got the last bit.
Maybe it's Mandarin.
I worked in a Chinese grocery store. I can swear in Cantonese really well. And in fact, I've got a funny story about that because I worked with Shannon Lee, who was an accounting person, and she always swore in English when she'd be doing accounts receivable at a newspaper where I worked, and they wouldn't pay. And so I thought she was very comfortable with swearing. So I used the D word, which you probably know, and just for fun. And then it was really shocking and upsetting for her. So I realized you don't, just because somebody swears in English, if they're Cantonese speakers, doesn't mean you have a license to swear in their presence in Cantonese.
You should check your sources courses. Maybe they did you dirty. Maybe they did you. Maybe they taught you.
45 years ago in grade 8.
You gotta call them up.
Okay, are there other questions? Anyone else have any questions in the audience? Okay, then I'll ask a question. I have more. I've been asking questions for over 30 years, so it comes quite easily. Okay, according to the last census, 53.5% of the City of Vancouver's population was, and this is Statistics Canada's term, visible minority. That's the City of Vancouver. But that, in fact, makes the entire cohort a visible majority, and that's Vancouver. Largest group was Chinese ancestry, about 25%. And I want to ask each of you, what are one or two things that we can do to amplify Asian perspectives in arts and culture in Vancouver? And I'll start with you, Derek.
What we can do to amplify Asian arts and culture in Vancouver?
Asian perspectives in arts, yeah.
Right, in arts and culture.
Or one thing.
One thing.
If two is too much.
Never too much. Honestly, come to things like this, and part of it is also, yes, try to learn the language. Like, it is fun. Like, try to engage with what we have to say, and well, there's also a very, like, this is switching hat to managing artistic director of Vancouver Asian Canadian Theatre. That I don't know if y'all know, but arts in Canada is mostly funded through government grants and some private foundation money. So you know, and if you really want to support Asian stories, so to speak, go to those shows, definitely, or if you can, donate or volunteer, or you know, and there's so many ways to also help. Like, yes, we need an audience, so please be an audience. That's the first and foremost of what I would ask of you, and that's often the only thing you need to do. But you know, if you want to do more, like, definitely, like, look up organizations, look up you know, like, even like Vancouver Southeast Asian Special Events Association. Oh my God, I got it right.
Asian Canadian.
Asian Canadian. Damn it, I did not. Sorry about that. Yeah, like, look at those organizations. Look at who is supporting interesting work. Look at who's doing good work in good ways. Look at who's treating people right, and support those organizations. Like, you can donate or not, go to their things. Numbers are very important in our reporting to the government as well. Or even just leave a comment and go, hi, I really enjoyed that. Would you do it again? Because now we know you wanna see it again. Or donate, yes, money. We always need money, but not everybody has money to donate, especially these days. So don't if you can't. Yeah, you know, yeah, come see our things. Come see our things. Chat with us if we're around. You know, yeah.
Okay, Natasha, what are your ideas to amplify Asian perspectives in arts and culture?
That's everything. No. There's always more, but like, this feels like such a like lofty thing, but like, don't be afraid of having like leaders that are in the minority. Like, I think that we've gotten to the place now where we're like in the rooms, and that's kind of nice, but they still want us to shut up most of the time. I don't know, I feel like there's been many rooms that I've been in where it's like, we're so glad you're here, now shh. Like, look pretty, look brown, look Asian. And that's, I don't know, like, that's not, I think we need more people in leadership positions and not afraid to like push back. I think something that I'm really grateful for is having Vancouver Asian Canadian Theatre, having places like the Culture Ignite Festival that puts you all on kind of an equal playing field in terms of the panel, and like, that was the first time that I got to curate something and actually have my voice be heard and like be able to fight, and that put me in a position to be able to go like, we should program these people even if they're not super experienced. I think the more we trust leaders like us, the more we see people like us, like, actually getting a say in things. Because I think, like, even though we are here and we are doing art, we very much are still tokenized to an extent. I think that we're more valued when we go with the flow of things, and I think that the next step forward is to be in the leader chair, I guess.
Well, I have an event on Sunday. I am co-producing it through my nonprofit, but the event is called Notebook. My friend Varen is co-organizing it, and we're bringing a artist. Their name is Bella. They're from South Korea and based in Berlin now, and they make incredible music with like Korean folk music integrated with like metal and like performance art. Yeah, so it's really cool. So it's a KW studio. You can follow me on Instagram. I will repost it if you want to come to the show. It's on Sunday at 7 p.m. And I also want to just like follow up on some of the things that you guys were saying. Also, I think like being Asian is not a monolith. It's a very big place. And there are also a lot of Asians with terrible politics. So I don't think all Asian voices should be amplified. I'm biased here, so I don't think all Asian voices should be on the mic. We need to amplify Asian voices that support equity, and Asian voices that question capitalism and imperialism, because there's a lot of there's also a lot of pressure. I feel like within Asian communities and like with the model minority and things like that, where Asian people, especially light-skinned Asian people, kind of take on the role and perpetuate white supremacy. So I think it's really important to listen and to connect with other folks that may be rejecting or critical or offering different perspectives to potentially the Asians that are in power or that hold power, especially in this city.
And Yilin?
Yeah, I just want to say that I really agree with everything that's been said already. And I was looking up something because I wanted to confirm the name before I kind of shared. But as folks may know, there's been like a lot of gentrification going on in Chinatown. So I actually want to shout out an organization called Chinatown Together that's been doing a lot of organizing work in Chinatown to fight against gentrification, supporting like elders as well as kind of low-income folks and other marginalized populations who are being displaced because of gentrification, and looking to reclaim that space for the community and kind of bringing different folks together. They've been doing various kind of weekend events, like calligraphy, like kind of like lion dances, like literary events, like kind of mahjong and malls, tai chi, etc. So I definitely recommend folks kind of to check them out, and also to kind of support and donate to the wonderful and kind of really crucial work that they're doing. The other thing I also want to emphasize again is, like Chinese voices and kind of identities are not a monolith, So we need to really think about like reading and looking at like a very wide range of representation. Speaking as a writer, this means reading like lots and lots of different Chinese, Canadian, Chinese, American, Chinese diaspora authors. Not just the famous people, not the token 1%, Amy Tan or kind of whoever is like super well known and nobody else. And kind of sometimes the publishing industry likes to be like, okay, like this publishing house, this agent, we have our one Chinese Canadian author. That's it. We can't be like that. We have to kind of make systematic change and to actually like open the room, for like a wider range of folks. And to make sure that we kind of consider intersectionality, and so that's kind of what I have to share.
Okay, I'll Oh, we've got another question.
It's okay. I just want to make a comment. Thank you for all that. I guess I'm a generation before you. When we moved to Canada, I was 2 years old, and we went to a small coastal town here in Canada, and we were the first Asian family that lived there. So I guess it was assimilation. My great-grandfather's Chinese. My parents are both Filipino. So when people look at me, they don't really know what I am. My parents didn't teach me Tagalog. They wanted me to learn English, so I only really speak English. So I don't really have an identity. I know I'm Asian, but what kind of Asian am I? So I appreciate there's like a lot more opportunity now to explore that, because years ago there wasn't. And it's just really exciting that, you know, you're speaking up and talking, and it's just really wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, that raises an interesting question, and it's about nomenclature. And some people think a term like Asian American or South Asian erases identities, but then some others actually like that. And I'd like to hear from each of you how you'd like to be identified, and what your thoughts are on nomenclature. Derek?
Yeah, I can start. It's funny because when I walked into Vancouver Asian Canadian Theatre in 2022, I pretty much asked the same question to the company, Vancouver Asian Canadian Theatre, for mildly problematic colonial sounding and meaning words in this configuration. We don't have an answer, but I think it depends on who's using it. Who's using it and in what context? I know it's a bit of a cop-out answer because everything depends on the context. But when it is used to blur distinctions and to group people into one easy to deal with lump, then that's not great for me. But when it is being used perhaps as a bit of a shorthand to find common ground, to go, hey, at least we have something in common here. Let's skip the tutorial here. Like, I know you know what a xiao long bao is, you know, or whatever, you know. I think I'm hungry. So yeah, that's my somewhat inarticulate thought on that. It really depends. If it's used to discredit, nah. And it has been, and historically it has been, you know, that's what it is, right? Like, oh, Asia, this continent of however many billion cultures and peoples. Yeah. And there's a bit of like reclaiming too, right? Like the word like Asian, it's not in like any of my languages, for example. Like it's a designation kind of assigned to me. So I think there is a piece of reclaiming in there as well, but not in under 20 words.
Yeah. Nat?
I don't know. I think I feel the same way about those labels as I feel the same way about like labels in the queer community, where it's just like take whatever resonates for you, and if that's like something that feels good for you, then that's great. Because I think that's really like all that matters. It also feels like a cop-out answer of like whatever you'd like. But yeah, it never really struck me that I was Asian. Like I know I'm Asian, but like it never like struck me until I moved here. And they're like, "You're Asian," and I'm like, "Yeah." We don't really say that back home because we're all Asian. I'll go like.
Oh, let's play this game.
You know
when did you all realize you were Asian? That's
20.
Yeah.
But yeah, like, I don't know, it's just, yeah. I feel like labels are usually, in a lot of ways meant to kind of go that you are different, and I think only if it feels good should you, like, take it on and be like, yeah, and it does help in grants. It does help a lot in grants, I will say.
Nancy?
Yeah, I agree with all you guys. Yeah, it really depends on who I'm asking money from, you know, and which visa I'm applying to. You know, I'm Taiwanese, but I'm definitely Chinese when I'm at the Pudong airport trying to get into Shanghai. you know. So, you know, I think again, like identity is always in flux, you know, and identity is always in reaction and response to a certain political climate, because you know you are who you are, but you know what passport or what visa you take out, that really, you know, that's to do with the government. That has to do with, you know, it's not really to do with the people, really. You know, those are like bureaucratic things. And I mean, you know, obviously I do tell everybody I'm Taiwanese. I think there's something about being Taiwanese is that you have to tell everybody you're Taiwanese. And, you know, because of the peculiar political situation that it's in. But again, like I feel like, you know, even just the formation of Taiwan, like as a concept, like in recent years, it's like these are all things that came in recent years, like post-Cold War kind of like, you know, concepts. You know, these things, Taiwan didn't exist like in the 1800s, you know, as a concept necessarily. It was something very different then. So I think, again, I think, you know, it's whatever, like you said, like that you're comfortable with at the moment, whatever that keeps you safe as well. Like I think you use whatever identity that helps you maintain a sort of safety. And also, you know, it's whatever you want to signify, you know, whether that's politically, through your identity, through community, socially. Yeah, it's always just in flux.
Yilin?
Yeah, so like for me, I remember kind of hearing and reading a little bit about how kind of the term like Asian American was coined as like a part of kind of solidarity and kind of organizing among different kind of Asian community groups in the US as a result of the Cold War and other things. And so I think about kind of that history when I hear that term. At the same time, like I'm you know, like a light-skinned Chinese settler on indigenous lands, you know, and when I hear kind of and see like events often kind of about like Asian representation, and then I often see like, oh, like it's always like, you know, the Chinese folks from mainland China, or like, you know, maybe Hong Kong, or maybe like East Asians, you know, who are kind of somehow seen as kind of representing all of Asia. And I need to kind of be very mindful of that there, you know, Asia is such a big continent and there's such a wide range of different groups. And we do kind of be careful not to be like erasing like, you know, Southeast Asian or South Asian or, you know, other kind of identities when we talk about like what is Asian. And so like I like to kind of interrogate that term, and sometimes I think it's helpful to be more specific instead of kind of creating the impression that it's just, you know, we're all Asian. I've had the experience at like various literary events where like I would get like mistaken for like another Asian woman. I don't know if anyone else in this room had this. I've had people come up be like, oh, are you the, you know, author who wrote so and so? And I'm like, no, that's like the other Asian poet. So yeah, and I'm like, you know, that's like a type of, you know, racism where you're kind of getting mistaken for each other. And I think it is also a like issue where people don't see you as kind of distinct individuals and more as kind of like a representation of like your cultural group or your ethnicity or your race, you know. So that's kind of what I think
I'm
about.
also curious, Yilin, in China, how people self-identify if they, and it's probably all over the map, but whether it's nationally or whether it's by province or whether it's by region or...
I feel like there's a lot more like regional kind of identification. You know, in China, I'm like, you know, I'm not going around and be like, I'm Chinese, like everyone's Chinese, you know, just like everyone is Asian, you know. Do I really think about the fact that I'm Chinese, you know, when I'm in China? Not really, you know. You're just kind of hyper visible and kind of more sensitive about that when you're maybe like the visible minority. But yeah, so I think people, you know, think about other kinds of identities, like, you know, what province I'm from, you know, what hometown I'm from, you know, where do I have kind of ancestral ties to, what kind of dialects do I speak, going back to the language question. So I think that's kind of how people think about it. So like I, like to introduce myself as, I'm Sudanese, I'm all these other things in addition to being Asian.
And are there another question?
Hi all. Sorry I was delayed. I was working artisting on the fire. But I had a question for you all. And I preface my apologies for being late because if you may have talked about it already, then you can skip it. But based on what you're saying here, if it does happen, how do you navigate pressures to creating content that is externally identifiably Asian? And is it nuancedly different depending on the generationality or geography of an audience?
Does anyone want to take that on? Question about, can you repeat the question you said about the...
Sure. Maybe I can provide some quicker context too. I'm also a poet and theater maker, and sometimes when I get booked by whatever granting body or festival, I'm feeling the pressure to perform specifically like Asian Chinese work or like this type of work. And that depends and changes and shifts depending on the generation of the audience or where I am, whether it's in North America or Asia or somewhere else. And I was wondering, like, how as artists do you navigate those pressures if they exist for you?
I was just gonna quickly say that definitely exists. I think there's a term called it's like cultural essentialism. So that's kind of the terminology where it's like, for example, Chinese work, you're gonna do calligraphy and like Gujin or something like that. Like that's kind of the vibe, right? Or like so that definitely exists. But I think as I make like more contemporary work that like I work in electronic music and stuff. So I think you just say that you're gonna do it and then you just do something else. Like that's kind of how I navigate it.
Did you want to add something, Derek?
Yeah. Hi. I think that, yeah, there's definitely a lot of that. Like I have definitely done that before, but in some ways I can always kind of link it. Like I can back up my, like I can make up a version that will satisfy them, like of what the new description of the thing, but also oh, anyway, no, I think I forgot what I was about to say. I'm sorry. Yes. I do that. I do feel like sometimes I have to do that, and sometimes the line between like, oh, do I want to do this or do I have to do this kind of gets blurred. But specifically referencing, say, I do write in a lot of Southern, like Hong Kong Chinese rituals. A lot of them around death. In my performances, and very actively fighting against that kind of perceived demand. I do bastardize a lot of those rituals, like purposely doing them wrong. A, to serve the story. B, in case they work, and C, as a bit of a act of rebellion of like, oh, you won't know the difference anyway, would you? Huh? And then those who know, well, then I know who you are. Then we're pals. So yeah, a little like subversions, through subversion, I think. Apparently.
Are there any more questions? Did anyone else want to respond to that, or? Okay.
Yeah, I think I agree with what's been said already. And just to like add a little bit, I feel like you can just do whatever you want, like screw up people's expectations, I think there's this pressure, to perform culture or race, but like you don't have to, right? Like if you're not interested, like, white folks don't get asked to be like, oh, like, everything you wrote has to be somehow representative of Canada, or like whatever white kind of heritage they have. And we don't have to kind of conform to that as like Chinese diaspora or kind of Asian creators. And, if you want to, like, that's part of who you are, and that's great. And like, you can be proud of that, I like to think about what kind of the science fiction writer Ken Liu once said about representation, which is like, no one individual should feel like all the burden of representation. And the kind of solution to that kind of problem is that you should have so much representation that no one ever has to worry about kind of individually representing the whole group. That if you have just so much representation, that everyone can do whatever they want, and you get to see like all the different ways in which Asian writers or kind of artists can create, and then that would kind of be much better than thinking about like one person having to be like, I had to speak somehow for my group. Like,
That's a wonderful way to wrap things up because we're running out of time, and this is supposed to end at 8 o'clock. I want to thank you all very much for attending our panel discussion, Beyond Chinese, How Identity Shapes Artistry. Please give a warm round of applause for our outstanding speakers. Derek Chan, Natasha Chew, Nancy Lee, Yilin Wang, each in their own way is making an enormous contribution to our culture in Vancouver. At Vancouver, our slogan is Become a Cultural Navigator, and I can assure you that each of these speakers in their own way has helped me along this road. So I really encourage you to check out their work. And thank you very much. We're going to have one more session, Beyond Chinese, a panel discussion tomorrow in the same room at 2:30 p.m., and it will be about cultural institutions and how they're reflecting diasporic populations. And we'll have speakers from the Museum of Vancouver, the Vancouver Art Gallery, and the Chinese Canadian Museum. So thanks again for coming, and I hope to see some of you tomorrow.